kid, I loved monsters. I was the weird little girl who read famous monsters and who made Aurora monster models with my dad and watched all of the Universal monster movies. But I didn't really read a lot of horror as a kid. I don't know why. Maybe because there wasn't a lot of it except Poe and Lovecraft, which I read. But when I was about 20, somebody handed me a copy of a book called The Dark Country by Dennis Etchison. And that book kind of exploded my consciousness, as it were. It was the kind of thing that not only did I realize it was what I had been wanting to read for a long time, but it was what I was sort of wanting to write. At that point in my life, I was still completely involved with screenwriting. I had gone to college to study that. I had thought it was what I wanted to do ever since I was about 15. But I was getting... it actually took about 10 more years before I got very disenchanted with screenwriting, basically after I was successful at it. I made a couple of movies. They weren't very fun. One of them made me moderately well off, but it was not very satisfying. And I first turned to small theater, and then I turned to prose fiction. And fortunately, one of my mentors during this whole process was Dennis Etchison, who also lives here in the Southern California area, who was extraordinarily kind and encouraging to me, always has been. And also Roberta Lannis, who is another local writer here. And Roberta really became my mentor. She was the first person to read the stories I was writing in the early 90s. And to say, you know, these are good enough to submit, which is always an incredibly important thing for a new prose writer to hear. This is the kind of cemetery that you find a lot of in Los Angeles, and it's a really interesting place. This is, what we're in right now is actually called the Portal of the Folded Wings. It's a tribute to air pioneers, because of course we have a lot of aeronautics here in Southern California, but cemeteries in Los Angeles have their own distinct flavor, like so many other things in Los Angeles. We don't have a lot of the big above ground tombstones, and we don't have a lot of what other people might think of as history. But just because we don't have things that go back to the 18th century doesn't mean that we don't have interesting history here in Los Angeles. I've always been interested in the history of this area, dating back to the 19th century Californios who used to live here and who had their big estates and who paved the way to what would later become Los Angeles when they founded the Pueblo here. Of course, everyone thinks that Los Angeles is about nothing but the movies, and that's not true. It has a much more interesting history than that, although that's part of it. And I love that history. I love using that in what I write. We are about to drive past the real-life Castle of Los Angeles. My second novel, actually, that I wrote, but the first one to be published, is based in large part on a real-life collection of buildings on the periphery of downtown Los Angeles called the Brewery. The Brewery is actually, I think, something like 17 different buildings that all combine to form the world's largest artist community. And I used to have friends who had their own small theater in the Brewery. And the Brewery has a very old history. It started as a century-old building that was once an Edison power plant. I always thought it seemed like a perfect place to be haunted. So by the time you added in the idea of some people trying to pursue art in this location, and specifically trying to pursue small theater, which is something I've done a lot of and know a lot about, it started to add up to a really interesting story. It kind of obsessed me for a while, and when it finally came out and I got it on paper, I was pretty happy with the end result. So we'll see if anyone agrees with me or not, but I think the Brewery is going to be right here on our right. There it is. All of these buildings we're passing are part of it, but this is the main building right here. You can see the wonderful design that the Edison Electric Company goes on the edge of the building. And now we come in into downtown LA, which is another part of where the Castle of Los Angeles actually takes place. I'm kind of an old-fashioned writer in many regards. I grew up loving books, even though I made a lot of my living as a screenwriter for a while. My first love was always books. My mother managed bookstores, and I started working in bookstores by the time I was 14. She used to pay me in used books. And I've been working in bookstores on and off when I didn't have a film job or something else ever since, really. So that's a long time now. And that love of books has spilled over into my writing style somewhat, I think. I am never going to be a master stylist. I will freely acknowledge that. I emphasize story, character, plot is very important to me. And that gives some of my things, I think, somewhat of an old-fashioned feel. I love pulp novels. I love noir. And I also am always somewhat hesitant to make that big bold leap into e-publishing, just because I do love these things so much, these bound printed on paper things. I love both cheap throwaway paperbacks. I love beautiful collectible first editions. I'm just a total bibliophile. The novels have been a real rediscovery for me. I went for years thinking that it was almost impossible to write one because I was so used to the 5,000 word format, and even when you write a feature-length screenplay, that's no more than 20,000 words. So the idea that you could write 90 or 100,000 words was kind of mind-boggling to me, and then when I finally sat down to do it, it wasn't really that hard. And I kind of got addicted to the format. Now I love it, and I'm working on my fourth novel right now, which will be a sort of dark young adult fantasy. This is our Iliad bookshop mascot, Zola, the one-eyed pirate kitty. She's quite the charmer and obviously fairly photogenic, yes. She's got a very interesting literary background. She was rescued from an insane animal hoarder by our writer friend Krista Faust, who is a wonderful person and a fantastic writer. We don't know where she got the name Zola, but obviously that's very literary as well. And she has been the favorite employee of Iliad Bookshop for almost 4 years now. Yeah, that's all right. We don't need to do the sturgeon.
You sure?
That one, yeah, that one's good. I like that
Okay.
one.
Let's do a real. Let me do a good close of it. Close up of
Okay.
it down there in the same place.